Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are currently reviewing and responding and refuting Mr. Brock Hollett's book, DeBunking Preterism. This is video number 10, and we're in chapter 4, and he is examining Matthew chapter 24. Where Jesus said there's going to be famine, earthquakes, perils, etc., etc. And he said these are the beginning of birth pangs. Now, Mr. Hollett makes a point in the opening of chapter 4. The ancient rabbis, following the tradition of the Old Testament prophets, taught that the birth pangs of the Messiah would be a period of increasing distress and tribulation that would come upon the Jewish nation and the world prior to the arrival of God's kingdom. Well, in that he is absolutely correct. The Old Testament is full of Old Testament references to the birth pangs of Messiah. Now, it doesn't use that specific term, but that's the concept. The Old Testament uses the term of travail, birth pains, and things like that. And passages like Hosea 13, Isaiah 26, Jeremiah chapter 30, hosts of other passages speak of the last days when the birth pangs would give rise to the kingdom. Now, what were those birth pangs? Well, there were a number of different things, but under the broad general heading, it was called the Great Tribulation. And it involved famine, pestilence, warfare. Now, what is incredibly interesting here and revealing is that while Mr. Hollett admits that that's the things that Jesus foretold, he says, quote, many events in the mid-1st century A.D. could be said to represent the conditions Jesus termed the beginning of the birth pangs. And he lists some quotations from Josephus, Tacitus, Dio Cassius, and other historians chronicling the exact thing that Jesus said. But then, of course, he says, well, we can't take that too seriously because, after all, war, famines, pestilence, earthquake, warfare are all kind of normal conditions of life. They happen in every generation. Well, okay, that's sort of kind of right. But he tries to delineate from those things, saying, well, yes, those things happen. The very things that Jesus said would happen in that generation, but they do not represent the birth pangs of the Messiah. Now, by the way, let me point something out here. Among the birth pangs, not as one of the birth pangs, but at the time of the birth pangs, the Old Testament prophesied that in the last days, and let me correct one statement here, not as part of the birth pangs, okay? I want to be careful there. But in the last days, as part of the last days narrative, Elijah would come. Well, guess what? According to Jesus himself, Elijah was John the Baptizer. John the Baptizer was Elijah. Matthew chapter 17, 10 through 12. Jesus was emphatic. Elijah has already come. I've written a book on this. It's on my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Now look, if one of the signs of the day of the Lord, if one of the key end-time signs of the end and resurrection and the kingdom, etc., was to be the appearance of Elijah, then since Jesus said that John was Elijah, that alone falsifies every single thing that Brock Hollett says. But let's continue here. He said, preterists present this historical evidence as proof of preterism. However, it should be noted that such catastrophic events have and do occur in every period of history. Well, once again, there's some validity to that. But we have to take into consideration the fact that Jesus foretold those events for his generation. Matthew 24 Verse 34, verily I say unto you, all of these, this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things are fulfilled. Now, Mr. Hollett wants you to believe, wants to convince us, well, yes, Jesus said this generation, and those things did happen in that generation, but he wasn't talking about his generation. He was talking about another generation, at least 2,000 years removed, that would eventually see those things. That makes nonsense of Jesus' discussion with and to his apostles when he said, you will see these things. He did not say they will see these things. He didn't say some future generation will. He was speaking to living, breathing human beings representative of that very generation, and he said, you will see these things. But then Mr. Hollett tries to convince us that those events of that generation were not the birth pangs. Now, I want you to notice what he does here. Jesus warned, this is on page 36, Jesus warned against a premature identification of these initial signs, most likely because these type of events occur to a lesser degree in every period of time, unquote. Now, I've just got to stop right here. I want you to notice that on the previous page, he said, Josephus and other historians chronicle the rise of false prophets, false messiahs. Thank you, Mr. Hollett. In Luke 21 and verse 28, Jesus said, many will come in my name saying, I am he, the end has drawn near, do not go after them. Now watch this. Mr. Hollett agrees that Jesus, quote, warned against a premature identification of these initial signs, unquote. Thank you, Mr. Hollett. Not only did Jesus warn against a premature identification of those signs, he warned against and condemned premature declarations that the end was near. Now, watch this. And for time, I could only list this one example. Jesus said, false teachers will come saying the end has drawn near. Do not believe them. Thus, premature declarations that the end had drawn near are condemned. Let's see, who was with Jesus that day? Peter, James, John, and Andrew. Later in that very generation, Peter, one of those who heard Jesus warn against making premature declarations of the end, wrote 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7. The end of all things has drawn near, unquote. Wait a minute. Do you catch the power of that? Here is Jesus in Luke 21 saying, false teachers are going to prematurely say the end has drawn near. Don't believe them, which obviously means do not make premature declarations of the end. Don't read the signs wrong. And Jesus himself had told that the Holy Spirit would be given to those apostles, including Peter, who would guide them to understand the things to come. So when Peter wrote, when he wrote 1 Peter and said, by the way, in the midst of tribulation, in the midst of persecution, which was to be a sign of the end, Matthew 24, verse 9 and following, Luke 21:12 and following. So when Peter wrote, in the midst of persecution, inspired by the Holy Spirit, sent by the Father who knew the day and the hour, and he said, the end of all things has drawn near. We have to ask ourselves the question, since Jesus condemned the premature declarations that, quote, the end has drawn near, unquote, and yet Peter said 2,000 years ago, the end has drawn near, unquote, was Peter guilty of making a premature declaration of the end? Now, remember, Brock Hollett says that Jesus warned against premature declarations, premature reading of the signs. He's exactly right. So, Mr. Hollett, the question is, did Peter misconstrue the signs prematurely? Did Peter prematurely declare the end of all things has drawn near? Listen, folks, if Peter prematurely said the end of all things has drawn near, then he was one of the very false prophets that Jesus condemned. And thus, Mr. Brock Hollett, by admitting that Jesus condemned premature declarations of the end, has done one of two things. He has condemned Peter as a false apostle and a false prophet, since he said 2,000 years prematurely, according to Mr. Hollett, the end has drawn near, or Mr. Hollett has condemned and destroyed his own eschatology. He has completely refuted his own book, DeBunking Preterism. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's morning musing. Hey, listen, go to my website, order the book, Elijah Has Already Come. Be sure to mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping, saving you $5. It's a great offer, and let me tell you, you will be stunned at how clear and how undeniable the evidence is that Elijah came in the first century before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Well, thanks again for joining me for this morning's morning musings. Hope you have an absolutely fantastic weekend. Be safe. We'll see you on Monday.